Afternoon, everybody. Now, this will be a great talk. I'm very much looking forward to from a lot of people. Apparently not in some other circles, but hey ho. Great to bring you this afternoon from Ireland and from late evening in Perth, Western Australia, Cameron Kippen. Afternoon, Cameron. Evening.
Good afternoon. Good evening. Aha. Hi. How you doing?
Great. So for anybody who doesn't know Cameron, I first came across Cameron back in the mid to late 90s with all his work that he was doing at the time through Curtin University in Australia. And Cameron has quite a varied sort of history in the podiatry world. So Cameron, tell us a little bit more about your journey to sort of Perth and Western Australia from sunny Scotland. From sunny
Scotland. Well, I trained in Glasgow and became a chiropodist.
We might have a delay.
Worked in Oxford in private practice, and I really didn't like it. Went back to do teacher training. I really enjoyed learning, and subsequently became a teacher in the Glasgow School of Chiropody, as was now a Glasgow Caledonian, I think it is. But I was also keen to see more of the health service than I had access to as a teacher, and went into management and became a health service manager in an area of the UK that had the highest elderly population, with 22 full-time equivalent chiropodists as well. And I was very interested to see how on earth they coped. And so I did 2-year post-teaching research there and found health service management possibly one of the hardest jobs I ever did. And so ran back into teaching and worked in Edinburgh for a decade, during which time I retrained and became an instructional designer, all at a time when diplomas were becoming degrees, and that the profession then had a major problem, and that was how on earth do you make clinical training at the level of university, or at least at an intellectual level that university courses would accept. And my job was principally to go in and
so you shift properly that mind.
You're breaking up, unfortunately. You sounded as if you got a shock. Yeah, my job was to go in to establish courses that had crashed or were in the process of crashing and redraft the clinical education component. I had been to Dundee University, to the Centre of Medical Education, and studied clinical education and how you write it. And so therefore that's what I was doing, when all of a sudden, at the time, the very last place on earth to actually convert to a degree was New Zealand. And by chance, their education system was like Scotland. So that's where I went, and that took me into the Antipodes. After we managed to get a degree against all the odds, and I really mean all the odds, that was exhausting. So I became, and wanted to become a backroom boy. I was fed up being up front and disliked, and all the sorts of things that you get when you're a trailblazer. And so I came to Western Australia and started to work on degrees by distance, masters and undergraduate degrees, and looking at the internet, and I was particularly interested in multimedia. So I was in a very good place at that time to start to look at distance education, which is now everybody does it, but we were doing it back in the 90s. Yep. But we came up against a lot of resistance, which we managed to cleverly overcome. A small group of intellectual folks that were doing bits and bobs. That meant, unfortunately for me, in a sense, and possibly an advantage to the podiatry profession, because being a backroom boy, I'd no longer contact with podiatry profession, but influenced their education.
Got at them in another way. We came around.
Absolutely. Well, that's right.
It could be. I mean, that's always been one of my things that I think the podiatry course is taught the wrong way around. Biomechanics should be taught in the first year and the clinical practice at the end. But I think that's a talk for another day. Most definitely. Tell me then, how did that your journey then take you to to what some people would think would be a sort of a strange side of
well, no, it's not really a side of podiatry.
No, we're talking about sex, and we're talking about feet, and we're talking about footwear industry.
Yeah, the thing, Justin, is
we all got here because of sex, so
absolutely, absolutely. And I think the complication is, if it is a complication, is podiatrists assume that they actually have sole, and I use the words advisedly, rights to the foot. Yes. So subsequently, they get quite concerned when feet are wobbled about with our wobbly bits, and so therefore they take offence, and have done. Historically, it's been done all these years, and as I say, my predecessor, Rossi, who wrote about this extensively, was actually marginalised by his profession. Now, the podiatrists don't own the foot. They look after the foot that needs or is challenged. That's the end of it. So subsequently, for me, what happened was I was asked by a friend in 1976 to research a talk for a literary society on references to the feet and shoes in classic and biblical literature. That was what my remit was. And I was a student teacher and had a lot of time and access to a library that had a lot of podiatry chiropody materials. And so I started to look up all this stuff, honestly, and like a student threw myself into it. And no sooner had turned a few pages when all of a sudden I started to see things that were hilariously funny, such as I read the Chiropodist, which was the official journal, from the very beginning, 1913 onwards. And what happened was they would say in the introductory leaf is that the Chiropodist was the original and only organ of the profession. And I thought, oh, that's a funny word. And then when I was reading the accounts of the annual conferences, it said during the conference, healthy intercourse took place. And I thought, now there's a strange thing.
So, I mean, all these words that can be interpreted in different ways.
Absolutely. So I started to find and see, amass a whole lot of detail, much of which was hilarious and funny. And by contrast, the Chiropodist carried the official information from the society, but there was a little journal called the British Journal of Chiropody by Colin Dagnall. And what he would do is he would publish all the information that the official journal wouldn't publish. So you got to know all the nitty gritty about people who'd been struck off, etc., etc. And he also included references to the bazaar, which included Rossi's sex life of the foot and shoe. And I was always amazed. Yes. I would go to a library, look it up, read something, be hilariously killing myself laughing, go into the staff room, because one of the things about teaching is you shared a staff room with a lot of other podiatrists, which is unusual in many places. But nonetheless, you have a lot of things in common and so forth. And I would be telling them all the various bits. And they would look at me as if I was from outer space, you know, and they couldn't find it funny. And yet these are people that I'd known all my life, which shared body stories together. But the minute you connected it to feet, they took umbrage, literally. And I thought, this is well worth looking at. And so subsequently, that set me on a trail for looking for more and more information of this nature. And I became a raconteur and entertained people at dinners, and even became a minor radio personality, because I would speak the unspeakable. That's how I got started. In Perth,
I mean, the body of work you have is phenomenal.
You're breaking up.
I mean, I've been following your foot blogs.
Well, again, you're breaking up, but what I'll say, just carry on.
For years. Let me just see if I can get this. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, in Perth,
obviously there's a huge body for years.
Yep. Just to give you the magnitude, in Perth, as an academic,
go ahead.
You were forced into doing postgraduate studies. And at that point in time, in the 90s, you gained points for community work if you contributed to the community. And one of the things that the uni had was a community-based radio. And so I went down and ingratiated myself there and became a regular. And so every week I would speak to 50,000 people on various bits of feet and shoes. And I would, for fun, ask them to ask me to talk about something. And that just gave some form to the information that I had gathered. Now, I thought, well, what do I do with all this? Because there's not enough to have a book. I'm not really free enough to write a book. But what I will do is I'll put it on, as was new at the time, an e-book under the guise of the uni. And so therefore, there was a book went up about shoes and psychosocial aspects of shoe design. And that in the end, we were getting 4 million hits per quarter. It became the highest hit website at the university, and the best and biggest referrer to the university. So there was a lot of people were interested in catching that information. They, for some reason best known, whether it was to do with me and foot sex, I don't know, but they closed the podiatry department, but the uni continued to own the website. And I thought, well, that's only fair, by which times the National Library had taken over into their reference section. So I thought, oh, well, I'll start it again. And that's when I started the blogs, which were re-edits of the original material.
Yeah.
And bearing in mind, I was doing a lot of radio and television at that time.
But of course, it's not all about sex.
No, not at all. Not at all. It's just very.
No, I mean the first shoe. I mean, the first shoe was discovered, I think. You know, the first one that's stuck in a museum is about 10,000 years old, and I think the first leather shoe is about 8,000 years old. I mean, and you know,
yeah,
I mean footwear existed before then. So I mean, the history of everything. But of course, then I mean, there's the history in popular culture and history in music and history of sex and in film and everything that's used.
Well, the original book that I had, ebook, on the university's website, there were 33 chapters. So each chapter had one component section. Sex was one of them. The highest hit one was trainers. And long before Costain and these guys were actually into biomechanics, I was relating what I taught in biomechanics to shoe design. And subsequently picking up on the social attraction that kids had to trainers. And so subsequently that really brought in a lot of hits, a lot of young people. And the good thing about it, I felt as an academic, was you could have a bulk of work, which as people came in, they would, you know, make the comments, you know, it's a load of rubbish, or you don't know about this, you don't know about that, whatever. And that therefore allowed me to re-edit it with information that was coming in that I would normally never have had access to. Now, it so happened, again, the uni had a sexology program. And that one of the things, usually what happened was somebody would come up and say, you must be a fetishist, meaning me. And I thought, no, I'm not a fetishist. And I thought, oh, I wonder why I would say that. And that set me on another task of inquiry. And when the sexology program came up, I thought, I'll do my postgraduate work in sexology. And I did. And subsequently, when I started to put out papers and posters and various things to conferences, I got invited to Europe, to America, to actually present the work. So very quickly, I became acknowledged as a kind of expert. I don't know whether you get a prize for it, but people just didn't know much about fetishism. They thought they did, but there really was very little to actually pin it academically. And so I got invited to a fabulous sexology conference in San Francisco.
Yes.
And they didn't know where to put me because I was there to talk about the history of sex and feet. And so I got shoved into the S&M Madams group, a massive big conference it was, and they were all dressed in leather and all that sort of stuff. But they put me into this group because they thought I was odd. Now, if I can tell you, the S&M Madams were concerned about the competence of their members to be able to put electrodes onto genitalia, I thought, well, wait a minute, who's mad here? Who's bizarre? But what was thoroughly amusing and very informative is the concerns that they expressed, quite rightly, that were the same concerns that podiatrists had expressed about giving local anaesthetic into the big toe. So it was, I felt instant camaraderie with them. And the minute they heard me talking about defeat in sex, they thought, God, he is a bit odd. So it was good fun.
You were even shocking them.
Yes.
Literally.
Yeah, but so little information. There's just no bulk of information around.
Because there's a lot of, we get that questions from patients all the time. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink, what are you playing the feet for? All that sort of, it's like, it's the glamour and the money. Like my mate Jerry, he's a gastroenterologist. He just loves doing things like cameras to people.
Usually, I mean, again, the thing is, it's a long time since I practiced because I retired 5 years ago. But usually I would quell any kind of inquiry like, your feet and all that sort of stuff. And I'd say, well, I do it for sexual reasons. Well, that just keeps them quiet as they shrink in their chair.
Yeah, because, I mean, your patients have patients of odd things. And I think I did read in one of your blogs, though, that there was a predilection for people who work in the podiatry field with fetishism.
Well, again, it makes you think, gosh, I'm working with people like that. Now, statistically, I suppose, because very few people...
About statistics. Everybody loves research. So here's the research to back it up.
Well, that's right. But very few people have tried bravely to tell you how many fetishists there are. Now, there's a difference between if you're partial to feet in a sensual way, and you include that in your pre-coital activities, etc. That doesn't make you a fetishist. You might be a podophile, you just like that sort of thing. But fetishism is more to do with the foot or shoe or whatever object actually becomes a magic token or totem that allows you to overcome performance anxiety. And that's where you get people who are in psychological complicated areas of paraphilia.
Okay.
But having been titivated by touching, frottage is not abnormal in any way, shape or form, and common to us all. It's only when you start to substitute the naughty bits with feet, shoes or whatever, then you begin to see that you're in need of help. But you see, many people don't go to the doctor and say, look, by the way, I get an erection every time I see a foot. However, the person who actually makes the connection between podophiles and podiatrists is a lady called Valerie Steele, who's a very well-known, acknowledged researcher and fashion historian. And she wrote a fab book called Fetish. And in it, she makes reference to podiatrists who actually have to wear diapers during operation because they may get overly excited fondling their patient's feet. Really? Now, I did meet her once, and I promised myself if it did, because she doesn't make a reference to it, she makes, she tells you, but doesn't say how she knows. But I promised myself I would ask her. But when the shove came to the push, I was frightened to ask her because I thought, oh God, I might know a few of these people.
Yeah, they may have been in the staff room with you. Yeah.
So, get it at a shop.
Yeah, I mean, you've got all the, you've got all the Sarah Ferguson toe sucking things and the, all this sort of thing. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean you're a deviant.
No, again, the thing is, like one of the things that with toe sucking and skin licking and so forth, people actually can be turned on by salt, perspiration. And it's not the actual toe sucking that's the big deal. It's the idea you're getting access to a solution of salt from part of the salt. So it's not as it may appear. But the thing, you posted a thing today about a boy who steals thongs or sandals.
124 pairs of thongs.
Yeah. Now, I
don't know whether he's rolling in them or...
Well, the thing is that if they're taking sexual pleasure from the item, then he is a shoe fetishist. And shoe fetishists are known as restifists. So he's not turned on by feet, he's turned on by that shoe for whatever reason. Stealing shoes can have a sexual, or stealing anything can have a sexual connotation too.
Hankering for Havaianas, perhaps.
Absolutely. So all these things in themselves are worthy of further study. And I was looking at the hardcore stuff, because I took 6 months to look at foot sex, and by the end of it, I was so bored. I thought, oh gosh. But when you look at the hardcore stuff, one of the complications in the research is that fetishism, or foot fetishism, shoe fetishism, is very often only part of a co-moribund group of conditions that very serious criminals have. So for the sake of argument, you might be inside for lust murder, and you happen to be a shoe fetishist. So you can imagine the researchers look for the lust murder, because that's got a bigger ticket than fetishism, but they'll then include it.
Yeah, and if we go, one of course, the historical examples of shoe fetishism and is foot binding in China, in terms of feet and sex. I mean, that's an ancient history.
Well, it seems to date from the 11th century.
Yes.
I did a bit on this. Now, again, the long and the short of it is, what you have to look at is human beings don't do something for no reason at all. If you take the term zeitgeist, which means a sign of the times, something is happening that will allow that to take place. And the bigger picture you take of the globe, the more you can see the thing is not isolated. It's actually part of something that's a global event. Now, for example, hopefully this simplifies. I was speaking to somebody minutes before we went on, and he's a really well-known fellow in podiatry, who has spent a lifetime, like me, at conferences. But he can't take to Zoom conferences. And of course, in the COVID-19 era, this is becoming very much what will now influence that which comes after.
Yes.
So you have a zeitgeist, you have a bigger thing happening that's influencing the way we do things. So with foot binding in the 11th century, you have to say, what on earth would cause people to want to bind the women's feet? Now, if you come over to the West and say, round about the same time, in the 11th century, men's shoes got longer and longer and longer until they were 12 inches longer than the foot itself. And that lasted 400 years. So here's absolutely. Here's two major phenomena that has arisen on the globe at the same time. And the simplest way to describe it is look for a disease that would allow you to actually explain it. Now, in Europe, the long-toed shoe, plain winkle picker, were actually stuffed full of moss and grass. And so therefore, a young buck could walk around with two 24-inch extensions, which were painted pink and had bells on the end of them. And what that intimated to anybody and everybody around was they were interested in sexual frolic. And so therefore, an average-sized man could keep 3 women perfectly happy under the table, leaving their hands free to enjoy a healthy repast at a banquet.
He could. Yeah, I was just trying to figure that out. Yeah, he could.
You've got 3. Now, why on earth would you do that unless there was a risk of sexually transmitted disease?
Syphilis.
That's why you might do it. Syphilis. Now, up until the time I started to research, they thought syphilis only came into the UK and Europe in the 15th century with Christopher Columbus coming back from America. But there has now been remains found where syphilis was rife in the 11th century, not only in Europe, but also in China. So the Europeans went for the long pedal extensions. The Chinese went the other opposite way by shrinking the foot. Now, of course, with a shrunken foot, like a lotus foot, that altered the way the woman walked. And as we all know in biomechanics, changing your walking style actually alters the biomechanics of the pelvis. And so therefore what happened was the genital area became hypersensitive, as did the sole of the foot, and that the folds of the labia increased. And so subsequently, when men and women were getting it together, they actually could have a sexual incontinence, if you like, by rubbing feet, and or, as was the highest form of worship at the time, they actually procreation was what you really did, and so therefore the more you enjoyed it, the better it was. And so both men and women had fun with small feet. Now, getting there was not a joy for the women, but it wasn't something that, as would be seen by 21st century eyes, terrible affliction on women. That's only because we see it that way. At the time, it would be no different to modern equivalent of bracing children's teeth to make them look better than nature intended, so they could marry better. That was why the Chinese.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that was why the Chinese did it. They actually did it so that their daughters could marry well, and that meant that the older members of the family would be well looked after.
Yeah, yeah, and it was so. I mean, it's so intertwined. I mean, it was just normal in society.
It was one of these things, and again within societies, and we're all guilty of it. Once you get into a doctrine, you won't question a doctrine because that's a sacred truth. Whereas if you've got, you're outside the circle, you look at it and think that's a load of rubbish, you want to change that. So subsequently, there's many parallels to podiatry. For example, in podiatric biomechanics, certainly at the very beginning, it was a lot of rubbish, and still is, but nonetheless, it became a doctrine to which nobody would question. And it's only when people like Bob Kidd did and said, look, you can't base your whole philosophy on a tautology, then subsequently you got people saying, oh, can you not? And that's really what the new era of biomechanics is it's broken away from, the 70s belief that there was a subtalar neutral position. So it's very similar.
Still being taught though.
Well, again,
that's another conversation.
As an instructional designer who probably at the time, I certainly got a reputation for being radical. I don't really see that myself, but nonetheless, what you would get is you would say, well, there was two schools of thought. One was, if you were going to make a degree, we already have a degree in the diploma. We don't need any more things. But what we could do is to increase the content of the course to include all the things that we want to do. Now, as I say, I retrained in education, and that argument is wrong. What you do is you start from first principles, you decide what you're wanting to do and how you want to achieve it, and then you build the program up to get to that point. And what that really means is you have to cut out a lot of rubbish, because the student, in the end, the successful student, can pick that up in their own time or at a time more appropriate to their level of confidence. And so subsequently, there's just two ends of the argument, but stuffing curriculum is not a good thing. And as I would go in to help programs improve and say, you have to take that out, you don't need that there, or you can redraft it into somewhere else. What you found is the minute you were away, the old guard put it back in anyway, just in case we need it. So they wouldn't accept a new order was required, and they cocked things up and subsequently slowed the development down at that time. I think they're all dead now, so and they can't get back to me. But more or less, it's very frustrating if you're really trying to rethink the order of complex things.
Yeah, I do see, because there's just back to the foot binding. I mean, foot binding is now outlawed, and I think it was about 2 years ago I saw a photographic essay pictorial in Geographic about the last surviving foot-bound women who are now all well into their 90s and 100s. So they're dying. I think it is still happening in some areas, but very, very.
Well, there's two things. One is the reference you really want is Beverly Jackson wrote this fabulous book called Splendid Slippers. And she's a hard-bitten New York journalist who went to China and went into China when it was unpopular to do so, and found out about the women who still survived that had these things. And remarkably, what happened was there was two types. When the Christian missionaries realized what was going on in 1911 and 1912, they stopped foot binding dead. On the belief that this was bad, and you damn find what it was for, but they promulgated the myth that it was based on an empress who'd been born with club feet many hundreds of years before, and her father was so besotted, concerned about this, that he made all high-born Chinese women have their foot bound so his daughter wouldn't look odd. Now that's a myth. In actual fact, history says that he was a fetishist and he liked little feet and he loved dancers, and subsequently he wanted his daughter to dance like the dancers he loved so much. But the long and the short of it was that when the communists came in to China in about the same time, they recognized high-born families because of the bound feet. And so therefore, to have your daughter or wife in little bound feet, shoes, you would be taken away and killed. And so therefore it was outlawed. So the population that Jackson found and the ones that survived left the cities for the country areas, and they continued to work in the field. Now the secret was, provided they had the shoes for their feet, they could walk around and work perfectly well. But if you took the binding off, you sentenced the poor woman to absolute purgatory because the feet were damaged. And in the 80s and 90s, the feminist writers took a 20th century view at what was going on and said, oh yes, this is women being picked on, a good example. Whereas it wasn't. It was really part and parcel of just the belief that women were so sacred and so wonderful that they had to be kept. And that's actually what happened to all bound feet. Now, these folk are still alive. As to whether it goes on now, it's very unlikely it would in the same way. But believe it or believe it not, the new punks and the people who stick bits of metal everywhere, they're actually picking up on foot binding. And you can actually buy foot binding machines, which don't reduce your foot to 3 inches, which was the typical lotus foot, but they certainly reduce it in size and bulk. So it still goes on, but it's very much a minority sport.
Yeah, well, what there's related, because there is some research that shows that the smaller the woman's foot is, the more beautiful they are.
3-inch foot, you were really the Marilyn Monroe of the time. So
that throws up a lot of things. There's a couple of points there in terms of, as you say, sort of sexual signaling is a very big thing. I mean, if you look at, whether it's footwear, clothes, or whether what type of hanky you're wearing out of your back pocket in certain areas, depending, gives out us different sexual messages. And of course, I'm not allowed to swear anymore, but we're going to talk about fuck me pumps. Yeah, because every girl's got a pair.
Well, so
you heard that.
I do.
It's the sex cell. Yeah, probably.
Well, again, the thing is that one of the complications of heels and heeled footwear is that in fashion they were a men thing, not a woman thing.
King Louis, women only court shoes came from the court of King Louis. Nothing to do with.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Keep you up out of the shit, out of the heels. All the crap that was in the ground.
Not really, because bearing in mind, ordinary people didn't have any issues with these things. They were lucky if they could afford a pair of shoes as such. But when you're looking at court shoes and when you're looking at the fashion of shoe, you're really looking at only those at the top end of society. Now, if you were Catherine de Medici, for example, who's associated with heeled slippers, you did not go out and walk in the street. You had a sedan chair take you from room to room, and if you had to go outside, you went in a sedan chair. So the idea that these had a practical application is a myth. They were really there to make sure that you were held up so that you could look your best, and more particularly, the higher up off the ground you were, the more you had to wear clothes that covered your legs, and the more sumptuous clothes these were, the richer you were. So it was always decoration, never anything to do with practical issues. The problem,
they're not practical. They were bloody uncomfortable.
Well, again, they run marathons in them as such, but it's easy to marginalise them. And again, podiatry is not alone here. The orthopaeds are the same. But the likes of when they start in the history in medical literature, when you start to look, when men start to marginalise heels, it's during the French Revolution. And that what that means, two things, or just before the French Revolution, is Louis XIV wore heeled shoes because he was height challenged, but you couldn't criticise him. You couldn't even go to his court unless you had red-soled shoes, and he wouldn't allow you to come in unless you were of a certain standing. So the medics were unable to criticise men, but they found it easier to criticise women, belittle them, and particularly point the finger at sex workers. So all of a sudden, it became fashionable in medical literature to actually belittle women who were wearing heels, and that especially those that had entered the workforce. Because heels came into fashion in Victorian times, particularly because Queen Victoria all of a sudden wanted to go walking on the Glen up at Balmoral. And her husband got the shoe bootmaker to make Balmoral boots with a little heel. And these became incredibly fashionable. And it allowed women to come out, and working women wore boots with heels. In America, which is very interesting, what happened was there was a Scotsman behind it, but he took the initiative in France and said, well, look, you've got a lot of prisoners after the French Revolution, and why don't we get the prisoners to marry a prostitute from Paris or wherever and resettle them in Louisiana? Now, the big thing at the time was that the French girls loved to wear high heels, and subsequently they went and took the high heels to Louisiana. The problem implicit there was such a rough existence. Most of them died or were killed, and the girls went to New Orleans with their high heels and set up work as sex workers. And the American women had never seen anything so attractive as these wonderful shoes. And so therefore, by the beginning of the 19th century, that's where you get the fashion associated with sex, which prevails to this very day.
Everybody wanted a pair then.
Well, again, the thing is, it's like, Fuck Me Pumps actually comes from Shelley Winters.
Okay.
And what happened was, her and Marilyn Monroe were small and dumpy ladies, and that they were expected to look tall and sexy. And so therefore, the studios forced them to wear high-heeled shoes. Yep. Which were expertly made, but they had to promote themselves in such a manner that they got very little rest. So the term "fuck me" comes from the exasperation you get when you kick them off, not when you put them on. Albeit now, of course, you get Amy Whitehouse making it as if it's a statement for going out with the chavs on the Saturday night. Not what it seems.
No. And they are, it's a good song. Amy's song is a good song. As you say, right the way through the films with the starlets in shoes. There's a lot of films that are associated, and again, trainer culture associated with shoes as well, and of course, I was just having a quick top up earlier on of how many pairs of shoes I have. I don't wear fashionable fuck me pumps either. But I've got about 12 or 13 pairs between wellies for the garden, 2 or 3 different types of boat shoe, heavy weather shoes, deck shoes, some for your off, some for sailing in the dinghy, the gardening boots, trainers, a couple of pair of work shoes, those sort of fancy shoes. I mean, sounds like I'm Imelda Marcos, but most people will have a shoe collection somewhere.
Well, again, I suppose it's part and parcel of being children of the 20th century. What happened was that manufacturing started in a big way, and subsequently it became the fashion to have shoes for specific events.
Yeah.
And so subsequently we now have shoes that we only use for whatever, whereas our predecessors were damn lucky to have a pair of shoes. And so, like you
know, my granny used to tell me she used to go to school in her bare feet.
Absolutely. And that's within living memory.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I laugh. In fact, funnily enough, I got invited, as I say, I only get invited once, because once they hear me, they go, oh God, we can't have him back again. But I got invited to a prestigious biomechanics footwear conference, where it was very interesting. There were representatives of all the major sports shoe companies there, the designers, and they actually had a sit-round session where they were looking at where they were going in the future and what they were willing to share with each other. Really, it's never happened before. Very, very interesting. But at the same time, in the background, what they were doing, or what Adidas were doing, was they were very aware that they were going to beat this 2-hour marathon record.
Yes.
And subsequently they had the shoes to do it, and that was fine. And so subsequently you would pick up little bits of what was going on, and that more or less the long and the short of it was whoever's going to beat the record had to have the willingness of the other runners to allow them to run through or to take the stress, etc., etc. And they'd invented and got a new boot for them. Now, the guy that had designed it was wearing the boot, and I was looking at it. I was next to a very well-known man in the field, and I said, look at his boots, and look at his running shoes. And what they were running shoes with extensions on the end of the toe, not unlike the Polanes of the 12th and 13th century. They were like winkle pickers, but they actually had a sports component to them. Now, more or less, what you're looking at is heel height and toe spring. And of course, the more efficient the shoe is in pushing you forward with the new materials, then the chances are you might be able to do it in a more efficient way, sufficiently well enough, you would get the speed that you needed to finish on time. But it was the idea, this guy was standing and he was showing off his shoes, not deliberately, but certainly not missing the opportunity. And I thought, nothing's changed in hundreds of years. We still admire these gorgeous pricks on the end of feet. A prick with a prick on the end of his feet, I suppose you could say. I wouldn't, but you could.
Quite well bred pricks now, though. You know, the
Absolutely.
shoe deals. I just posted one today. Was the first, another big Nike, especially in women's soccer and women's football. A Norwegian soccer player just signed a 1.4 million 10-year deal. You know, it's a good chunk of change.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I worked with looking at soccer boots design and stuff, and more or less, you know, the likes of, they only start to become designer conscious in the 70s after England won the World Cup, I believe. But nonetheless, it was photo opportunity. I don't know, but it was photo opportunity. So that then you had companies coming in and wanting their logos and so forth to be seen. Where you get, if you chart the injuries, where you actually start to get an increase in injury, happens to be when they incorporate podiatric biomechanics into shoe design, which is in the 80s. Then the shoe designers realize we can't keep doing this. And so subsequently you get a move away into other aspects and areas of development.
Yeah.
Obviously the increase in stress fractures and so forth that arose round about the turn of into the 21st century probably was the time where you had optimal shoe design for men. And so therefore what you were really seeing was feet fractures that were related to overuse and overtraining rather than the shoe itself. But it's only very recently have women and women's soccer actually had any attention paid to them in terms of the boots that they need. So she probably needs the money.
No, but especially since they won the World Cup, we're looking for pay parity. We need to be right across the board, whether it's in the health service or HSE or, at any levels. Obviously, that's what we need to promote is pay parity.
Yeah,
genders.
It's a good example, Justin, of zeitgeist. It's a sign of the times.
Mm-hmm.
Power to people.
Yeah.
We all matter.
Yeah, because I remember at first, not that old, but Gutties. You used to have Gutties, those little sort of elasticated sided sort of pumps that you used to put on for shoes. And then I remember my first pair of shoes were a pair of Converse, or first pair of like trainers. We're a pair of Converse. I'm an Adidas man now, though.
Well, see, again, I was like you. In the 50s, when I was a lad, you got your sannies, which would be like guppies, and these were sand shoes. But the thing was, if you were really toffee-nosed, you got plimsolls, and you could play tennis with your plimsolls. Whereas I was a tough kid, so I got a pair of sannies. But what I used to do when I got to that age of 11 or whatever was I used to rejoice at the summer holidays just round about now, because all of a sudden my mother would get me a pair of baseball boots, which would be Converse, but I would call them baseball boots. And that was the
baseball boots. I don't know whether they were Converse or not. I just remember they came up
that's right. That's high ankle, Converse chucks, etc. So we were obviously clearly of the same era, and that I myself, I don't think I've got a pair of designer trainers. I do, but they're by an Italian designer, and I bought them in a sale in Rome. And when I wear them, people go, "Where did you get these?" I think, well, Aldi, actually.
Yeah, it's as you say. I mean, there's all this millions and billions of dollars in technology and research that goes into the footwear. People still get injured. Wonder why that is. Maybe it's got something to do with their body mechanics, perhaps.
Absolutely. No, I think the thing is, when you start to find that the marketing direction is that you're looking at a pair of shoes that are the same color as Michael Jordan's Porsche, you realize you've reached the end of design, and what you're looking at is marketing hype. And what they do nowadays, very successfully, is they will only make a limited number of shoes available and sell them online, and so subsequently, or in restricted pop-up stores. So it gives the false impression to the kids that follow these things that there is indeed a rarity and a blue chip trainer. Whereas in fact, there's not.
In London, you'll get regular queues in around Soho or in around Covent Garden and a couple of the Japanese trainer shops when the latest T-shirt or the latest pair of trainers is coming out, and there'll be a queue of like 1,000 kids looking for 20 pairs of shoes. And it's I can't remember what the stats are. I mean, it averagely costs Nike about $2.50 to make them. Yeah, and they retail them about, I can't remember. I put it up on my Facebook thing, and was it 15 billion last year or something, or was it 55? I can't remember. I'll have a quick look. It's nuts. It's absolutely nuts.
And it's like many things.
Tiger Woods and Wayne Rooney and everybody needs to get their sponsorship.
Absolutely, but it's like everything else. They will not share their research. So subsequently, nobody really quite knows what it is. You can bet your sweet bippy, if you get to a book called The New Lords of the Rings, which is about the Olympics and what goes on there, what the boy that wrote it says is that at the time of amateur level athletics, that the runners didn't know the shoes they were going to wear until minutes before the heat. And what made them choose a shoe was the amount of money that was stuffed in, because they weren't allowed to be paid, etc. So if they found that there was more money in one shoe than another, they would wear that shoe. Now, no sportsman alive, and you've worked with them the same as me, would actually compromise their performance. So you can assume at that stage, and I don't think it's changed, one shoe is very much the same as the other. It depends on the lolly that comes with it that actually makes the difference.
I mean, I've heard of sponsored sports with guys with a certain company wearing other shoes that are branded to look like their sponsor.
Yes, happens. It used to happen a lot in soccer.
Yeah.
Because there's one or two well-known players in the 70s and 80s being caught out because, for the sake of argument, they'd have a boot deal with Adidas, but they didn't like Adidas. And so subsequently they would have the 3 stripes painted on their own shoes, and then unfortunately went and played in inclement weather and the paint wore off and they had then to give the money back. So it does happen.
And I've also heard of, and this is an anecdote, this is just an after conference story where there was a podiatrist colleague who was ousted from a certain English club from the medical team because he raised concerns that the shoes that they were sponsored by was actually increasing the injuries. He was no longer needed. He got the boot. And they kept getting stress fractures. How nuts is that? How nuts
Absolutely. Many years ago, I worked in Glasgow, and Glasgow had the 3rd biggest marathon in the world. And so subsequently, I worked with a chap who actually did a survey early on, really talking about late 70s. And we did this survey on injuries and looking at shoes and the shoes that the people were wearing and the kind of injuries they had. Yeah. Now, that survey was sponsored by a company. And as it transpired, their particular product had a high rate of injuries. And I happened to be working with another boy in Edinburgh who had a similar survey doing on marathon runners in Edinburgh. And that what happened was that they were looking at a slightly different angle, but they found a whole set of data. And when we compared them, this company looked awfully bad. And what happened when they wrote up the survey was they made sure that the company who was the brand's opposition actually were highlighted as having the highest number of injuries by comparison to this company. Whereas in fact, they just massaged just the
massaging of the figures.
Yeah.
Make it look good. Keep your sponsorship deals. It's a huge global business.
Well, you see that currently with the COVID-19, where in fact people are really massaging data in order to get their publications out, and you think this is too important to be buggering about, really. And by the same token, these companies that are only in it for the money should not do that, and people shouldn't believe them. That's the important thing.
Well, that's it. As with everything, you have to make your own informed choice. But if your favorite, if your kid's favorite sports star is rocking the latest pair of whatever, that's what they want to play in.
Well, and that's just the social. That's the push from whatever. I remember when I was in Edinburgh, my kids were growing up. They were Thatcher kids, and subsequently would wear only designer gear. And I decided that, well, I could go into town and buy clothes that were of a similar status, but didn't have the logo. And so I used to nip around dressed, very much younger than I should have been at the time, in clothes that would have been in fashion, but didn't have the fashion logo. And the kids were totally and utterly unimpressed. And so what I did do was I set to and got logos made for myself and my clothing and got them stuck on. And the kids went, "Where did you get these?" You can't tease that.
Counterfeiting at the back.
Absolutely.
And good. And yet, just to get again to the film and to music and to and to this part of culture, especially trainers now are a huge. Huge. We talked about Amy's songs, and there's other songs that I have listed. And, you know, am I going to name off the top of my head? You know, I'm an Adidas fan, so you got Run DMC, My Adidas, you know, Ice-T, 6 in the Morning. I mean, all these sort of seminal, you know, the films that we put up, you know, She's Gotta Have It, Spike Lee, you know, amazing trainer scene. All the Sex in the City, all the girls are favorites of Sex in the City. I mean, so Carrie has lots of shoe quotes. I think one of them is, how come I own $40,000 worth of shoes and I don't live in a home? Maybe I'm the old lady who literally lives in her shoes. People spend a lot of money.
Absolutely. And the thing is, it's no different. It's just on a different platform where people will look up to those that are high heeled. So if you have a lot of money, what you have to do is you've got to have a collection of designer clothes, and that is promoted as being successful. Whereas I think probably if we were in a better world, what you would find is that nonsense falls away. Mm-hmm. And so subsequently you get back to being practical, and hopefully in this brave new world that comes, then that might fall away. I don't think so, but it might fall away. So we do give time and place to people who appear to us to have succeeded, and that invariably means they're dressed the way that you can't afford, and they've got a lot of it.
Yeah, well, I was lucky enough. I mean, I had where I practiced again in Covent Garden and central London, just around Regent Street and things. I had quite a clientele who were able to afford handmade shoes. You know, nice Berlutis. Yeah. So the Berlutis would have to go off to the lab with the orthotics to have them fitted. You know, because otherwise it would mean a whole new shoe collection for himself. Or you know, that was also a good thing with patients when you help to improve their foot function and pain. They were able to go off and then buy loads more shoes.
Well, that's right, and I mean that's in an ideal world. That's right. In an ideal world, that's what should happen. I mean, I'll give you two stories. One is when I was in England in practice in Abingdon, and there was a small cobbler's unit at the back of the shoe shop that the podiatry practice sat upon, and the cobblers were all qualified shoemakers that had gone through life and come to work in that place, and that they had a fabulous reputation. And it was at the time of glam rock, and what they got was contracts from Rod Stewart, Gary Glitter, you name it. There's a lot of female impersonators who sent their platform boots to be mended. Now, it was at a time where I would have to say many of my professional colleagues were poo-pooing the new style that would only land up, as they always do, with feet that, you know, never know comfort again. And what always amused me was when you spoke to the men in the cobbling shop, they showed you how the platform boot was constructed in such a way that you could dance safely wearing these, what would be in some instances, you know, 6 inches off the ground as such. So you thought, wow, that's fantastic, because the popular belief is that these are bad for you. And the guy says, not at all. That's why these folk can continue to perform safely. Now, there are stories of folk falling over, but nonetheless, in the main, you know, I don't suppose anybody knows much about Gary Glitter these days, but Rod Stewart doesn't appear to have bad feet as connected to his platform shoes. And so you actually got an insight into what was going on there. Now here, talking about trying to give clients what they need, I worked in a hospital down in Fremantle, and there's a lot of Indigenous Australians come in, most of which are street people. And I always remember there was a whole set of free shoes that you had that were supposed to be given out to people in need, etc. But that meant people that were able to afford it in need, as opposed to poor street people. And it was a Friday afternoon, and it was a very wet afternoon. And this old lady came in very live circumstances. And I thought, oh, mother, I can't let you go. I'll give you a pair of these shoes. And that was fine. And she was so pleased to have them. They were trainers, and they were fabulous shoes for her. And she went away out, and I felt really good. And then, by chance, happened to pass her in the town a wee bit later, where she was actually back in her bare feet again, but she was smoking and drinking. So obviously the shoes went elsewhere. I felt better for a moment, but not after.
That just reminds me, I'd just like to give a mention to the Forgotten Feet charity in the UK,
Absolutely.
where a group of podiatrists next May are going to do a charity cycle from Land's End to John O'Groats.
Oh, good.
Over 9 days, 100 miles a day. Should be quite challenging. So if anybody wants more further information, contact me or Forgotten Feet in the UK. And again, just not even in film, of course. I mean, even just in normal mythology and things. And I mean, well, maybe it is film or films being Disneyfied, but you know, the stories of Cinderella, there's shoes in there, and the elves and the shoemaker, and Pinocchio, and you know, Giuseppe was a shoemaker, was he?
He was.
He was.
Again, these circumstances, all that can actually be
there's a lot of mythology. I mean, you know, princesses and shoes. Is that where the FMPs come from?
Yeah. No, again, the circumstance would be that it's the firm belief that you are your shoe, and that shoes can change your life. So Puss in Boots, Cinderella, all has to do with the magic of footwear that can change you. Now, basically what it really relates to is there was a firm belief in the Middle Ages that if you were born into a class, you stayed in that class. It was wrong for you to move up a class or up a rung. Yeah. But if you had a magical totem, such as a shoe, that changed your circumstances, that was perfectly acceptable. And so it became, you know, part of mythology. The idea that there is something out there that is going to change your life. It just so happens that the focus is on the shoe. And in every culture is reference to footwear in some way, shape or form, which, as you say, has been Disneyized, so we see it in our 21st century eyes, but it belongs to antiquity. In Greece, for example, ancient Greece, it was considered if you didn't wear thongs or sandals, I'm that Australian, I call them thongs now, but if you didn't wear sandals, you would go to hell. So the sandal protected you from spending an eternity in the down in hell. It literally was a firm belief.
There was a huge. I mean, I know stories of, you know, all the Roman statues of long second toes on them, because that's the way. Because it is a sign of great beauty. And I heard of one sculptor who was beheaded because one of the Caesars didn't think the toes on the sculpture were long enough for him.
Well, there's a lovely lady in the UK who's actually studied Saxon feet and looking at length of toes and such things. More or less, the length of toe indicated ethnicity. And in Egypt, there are carvings of people with long firsts, seconds, and thirds. And subsequently, what it did show to everyone is how metropolitan, or how cosmopolitan, I should say, the culture was at that time, because you could get Romans, Greeks, and Mesopotamians all within Egypt. The idea of looking at sandals and the various thong variations relates to the length of toes which suit certain ethnicities. So subsequently, when you see the Jesus sandal with the piece of leather through the first and second toe, compared to other strappings, it all relates to the anatomy of that ethnicity at that time.
Okay, yeah. And I mean, even not with footwear, with feet. I mean, feet are looked at in different cultures very differently than we look at them here. Where's here? In the UK or in Australia or in America.
Well, again, the thing is, look at the metaphor. Look at metaphors in the English language. Feet and shoes abound. So too do they in French, Italian, Greek, you name it. Everybody has looked at feet and shoes in some way as a metaphor for something else.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's intrinsically human.
But feet are the gateway to the soul in is it Buddhism?
Yeah. It's the idea of being in touch with Mother Earth.
Okay.
And the idea you can't be closer to Mother Earth and through the sole of the foot, etc. So you get things like solistry and all that sort of stuff. I think there's 300 volumes of book in the study of the soul and what it means to the human condition.
Okay.
In Chinese, so I can't read it, but there is such a tome exists.
Yeah, because again, I think feet get a bad rap. You know, I think it starts off when the mum's playing with the baby when they're changing the nappy and they put the feet up and they're like, "Oh, you smelly feet," and it sort of all starts from there.
Well, again, that's how they say. But coming back to the beginning, that's how they say fetishism comes about. Is experiences when we're children very often can become mistaken and associated with other aspects, particularly as we grow into adolescence and so forth. So yes,
Mr. Freud knows a lot about that.
Yeah, I mean, again, the thing, we're human beings. That's what we do. I'm so grateful that podiatrists look after people whose feet are compromised. And in the end, again, I was doing a piece on looking at the history of podiatry, which is one of the ones I'm coming up with. And it's looking at the importance of the training schools in Britain in the 30s during the Depression. Because believe it or believe it not, none of us would have been here, certainly in the UK, had it not been for the Depression and the idea that the authorities then put up 3 hospitals that were patronised by the royals, and the royals came to visit. And the idea of chiropody was an anathema to the royals' researchers, because the word chiropody comes from David Lowe, who was a plagiarist. And he took a French treatise of the time, translated it into chiropodologia, hand and foot study. Nobody knew whether he was going to be rubbing the hands or the feet or vice versa. But nonetheless, in order to avoid prosecution at the time, he took this French treatise, translated it, retitled it. And that's where chiropody comes from, the term chiropody. And of course, because it had a dodgy origin, when the royals visited the 3 hospitals in order to applaud chiropody, they had to find an alternative origin and came up with the idea that it came from Chiron, the half man, half horse, who in fact was a great healer of the lame, far more suited to what they did. But nonetheless, had there not been 3 hospitals for the people who were unemployed, there would be no training schools. And of course,
I wonder whether they'll come up with some imaginary things to after this recession.
Well, that's right. I mean, I've been interested to watch how much of those that are seen in the areas that I work in, or at least contribute to, the podiatrists people, the high-profile boys, how much they are willing to become involved in COVID-19 and what they are wanting to do and see and to promote their services within that area. Now it's beginning to happen, but it's taken quite a bit of time. So you have high-profile boys in diabetes who appeared to either be silenced or ignored this dreadful thing we're living through. Now they're coming around to using it in order to, once again, promote their own very excellent services.
Yeah, it will be. It'll be interesting to see how that develops. Yeah, so we've covered quite a lot. I mean, there's so much more that we could go into again then about the sort of the origins of the profession, and probably even sort of deeper down into the footwear and the sexual peccadillos. I think if anybody missed it, I said, my strangest conversation was one time I had a practice in South London in Streatham. Cynthia Payne, a notorious madam, had her brothel a couple of streets away, and one of the girls wanted me to delay treatment when she came in for that afternoon. She wanted to put it off for a day or two because she didn't want the risk of the foot being sore while she was going back and having to get her on her PVC kinky boots later on that day for a session with a client. So that was an odd conversation.
I mean, I can relate to that. At one stage for my sins, I was the foot health expert on a sex program And people would actually phone up and ask if they were going to do this, that, and the next thing, how could they best protect their feet? And apart from, I mean, it was very serious, it was a very popular program, but apart from myself and the resident man behind the desk, who was invariably had to be picked up off the floor laughing, you had to keep a straight face and merry voice, but not necessarily laughing.
People take this stuff very seriously.
Absolutely, they really do, and you have to. Again, the thing is, one of the things that they taught you in the sexology program is you mustn't react. You must not overreact when you hear people say things that you would never say to anybody. And the reason for that is that often, depending on the circumstances and how ill they are, they get a buzz when they say something to you and you react. Then they've got you where they want you.
Yeah, that's part of their frisson.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Cameron, how can people who have enjoyed our conversation today, how can they find out some more about you, or where to find you?
Well, as you know, I exist on the internet. The best thing to do is to Google my name, Cameron Kippen. Yes. And you'll see a cornucopia of references that will get you involved in the various bits and bobs that I've got. Actually, I think I must have nearly 20 blogs now, and I can never remember the actual, they never remember the address. And of course, as you know, I'm banned from Facebook, so I can't share it on Facebook.
I'm working on that. I'm working on getting banned. Yeah, and I mean, even on Podiatry Arena, there's stuff going back for 20 years on it. You know,
I was there.
Yeah, we were there, and so.
I know Craig very well, and again, the circumstances, apart from anything else, was that invariably what you do. Well, I'll start again. Predating the arena, there was a blog. Not a blog, there was, I can't remember what they used to call them now, but nonetheless, it was a lot of intellectuals, so-called, speaking to each other. And it was run through the universities. And it meant that it was the very first time, literally, that the Americans would speak to the Europeans and the Australians and the Brits. It became very, very successful. And then Craig took to the arena onto a further plane. But nonetheless, it meant that there was a group of people who were anti-podiatric biomechanics, not from the fact it was new, but just from the fact it was rubbish. And there was a lot of people who were pro-Californian podiatric biomechanics. Mm-hmm. And I'd love to see the collection of conversations that took place, because they were long and battled, and all sorts of things. In the end, I think it came to pass that the Americans had to agree that the Brits and Australians were more clever than they were and had a better education system. Yes, but the Americans were surgeons, and that made all the difference.
Yes. Yeah, and I mean, again, it's fascinating. I mean, the whole history. I was talking to somebody the other day about that whole Crystal Palace group and the whole advent of LA and podiatric surgery and different things. I mean,
the Croydon postgraduate group was where it started.
That's right.
Because I used to fall out with them. I was a young lad, and I used to fall out with them. I said, look, you give all this business about what you do, the procedure, but you never show after photographs. That would sell a lot better if we had a before and after.
Yeah. It's been fascinating. Thank you very much. And again, thanks everybody. That's. I hope you enjoyed the talk today, and we'll be talking again in Spanish. Well, I won't be speaking in Spanish, but Thursday I'm going to be doing a podcast for our Spanish colleagues. We'll be live on Facebook on Thursday, so talk to you then. Thanks very much. Bye-bye. Good man. Sounds good.
Good. Okay.